Welcome back to our masterclass in writing a novel, your novel. We have been focused on several examples, chapter 1 examples. And in the last masterclass, we focused on chapter 2. This masterclass will focus on chapter 3. The masterclass 1 covered this book example. It was a prologue, a future scene that hints at danger in which the main protagonist has been imprisoned in a lava tube. Masterclass 6 covered chapter 2, and this was the true beginning of the story, introducing James as the principal character in his academic professional environment. This Masterclass 7 will address chapter 3 in this book example. What are the goals for chapter 3? It should begin pulling the threads a little tighter, bridging the everyday world introduced in chapter 2 with the central tension or the inciting incident of the plot. So what should chapter 3 do? It should build narrative tension. Something starts to feel off or dangerous. It should introduce antagonist pressure, deepen the emotional stakes, foreshadow what's coming, reveal character depth, and end on something that moves or nudges the story forward. What chapter 3 should not do is introduce too many new characters without focus, rush into action too fast without building the dread, stay too static. There needs to be momentum building toward the plot. So let's look at a chapter 3 example. A hazy sun filtered through the trees and the early morning breeze was refreshing. At this time of year, after the heavy rains of winter, everything was green and lush with blossom and spring flowers in abundance. The long, low-lying ranch house slumbered in the mild warmth, while at the end of a steep stone path in a white fenced corral, a solitary rider was putting a horse through its paces. The mare was spirited, and there had been a battle of wills ensuing for over an hour. With dark patches of sweat glistening on her heaving sides, she whinnied whenever the whip was brought down violently against her flank. The rider was Eric Banner, the current San Diego mayor and candidate for state governor. Awakened at his customary 5 a.m., he had breakfasted, dealt with his correspondence, and was now enjoying a little rigorous exercise. Although this exertion had not disturbed his neatly brushed blonde-grey hair, a slight sweat had started to break out across the brow of his strong, angular face. Around 50 years old, he was tall, strong, and muscular, and the intense morning workout had invigorated rather than taxed him. Jerking the reins first in one direction and then in the other, and kicking his heels deep into the horse's side, he repeated the instructions over and over until his commands were obeyed without objection. Finally, after riding the horse around the corral at a fast pace and stopping sporadically to test obedience, he felt satisfied. Catching sight of his advisor, Carl List, strolling down from the house, he dismounted, handed the reins to a waiting groom, and strode over to where Carl had taken a seat on a wicker chair in a gazebo surrounded by a small glade of trees. Carl's thick mat of white hair was cut short in a military style, And although his ruggedly lined face put him in his mid-60s, from a distance, his fit and trim physique gave the impression of a much younger man. "Good morning, Carl. How are you?" "Very well, thank you. I have some details for your attention," he replied with a faint but distinct German accent. The response, although polite and courteous, held no hint of warmth. "You know," Eric mused, pouring himself a glass of iced water, "there's much to be learned from horsemanship. It teaches you how to rule the living animal. And whether the weak is a horse or a person, the same set of conditioning rules apply." Carl held up a newspaper and displayed the front page. "Have you seen this?" This section introduces a new setting, a new character, Eric Banner, and provides immediate tonal and thematic contrast to the earlier chapters. The opening paragraph is evocative and clearly paints the setting, creates a peaceful contrast to the more sinister undertones that emerge later. The descriptions of the landscape and the horse scene are vivid and cinematic. Introducing Eric Banner while he's dominating a horse is effective. It establishes his character traits, discipline, control, aggression, without resorting to exposition. The battle of wills with the horse functions as a metaphor for Eric's worldview: control, dominance, power. The parallel drawn later makes this explicit and adds psychological depth. Eric's and Carl's voices are distinct, and the reserved tension in their exchange works well. Carl's German accent and clipped formality subtly suggest a history of ideological alignment without over-explaining. So let's take a look at the second half of this chapter. By midday, the heat was intense, and the slight breeze that barely stirred the treetops was insignificant. The warmth brought out the heavy, sweet smell of the honeysuckle that grew in profusion on the banks surrounding the ranch, and a small lizard, eager to get out of the glare, scurried into its damp, dark undergrowth. The sun beat down on the operative as he stood on the south-facing patio and reported to Carl, who sat listening beneath a shady umbrella. The young man's mouth dried at an alarming rate. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead and then began to trickle down his face. Running his sleeve across his forehead and pushing his sunglasses up his nose, he looked longingly at the jug of iced water on the wrought iron table in front of Carl. "Do you understand your assignment?" interrupted Carl. "Yes, sir, but..." "Ah, good. So we're not having a communication problem?" "No, sir, it's just..." The agent stopped as Carl lifted his hand. "This is important, so let me speak plainly. In this organization, you are either efficient or expendable. What are you?" Quickly lowering his report, he fixed his attention on a point off in the distance and answered, "Efficient, sir." "Good, you may go." With visible relief, he turned on his heels and left. Carl closed his eyes and massaged the bridge of his nose in an effort to relieve a tension headache that had plagued him all day. The umbrella offered shade from the intense sun rays, but little in the way of relief from the heat. Leaning back and closing his eyes, his head drooped to the side, and he slipped into an involuntary doze. As his mind drifted, shadowy figures and dreamy images emerged and slowly took shape. A distant memory came vividly to life that of when he was in his mid-teens aboard a submarine. A younger Carl sits in the officer's mess, massaging his temples, and stands to attention as an officer enters and pours himself a coffee. At ease. A graduate from Ordensburg, I hear. Yes, sir. Seeing his pained expression, you don't ever get used to it. You just get tired of caring. For these extended journeys, the boat's hold were inadequate, and so the extra diesel fuel and food was stacked on the decks with floorboards on top, dramatically lowering the headroom. Additional supplies were everywhere, loaded in all but one of the toilets, jammed up against the bulkheads and crammed into every conceivable space. This made the naturally claustrophobic environment even more unbearably confining. Discipline, a strong sense of duty and determination had helped him endure the first 3 weeks, in which he had walked permanently hunched until the deck supplies were finally used. To his credit, he had sustained without protest many of the hardships normally accepted by the seasoned submariner, like sharing a bunk with 2 seamen who had not washed for weeks, and using a toilet where the stench of overuse permeated into the living quarters. Sponge bathing with a bucket of seawater may have cleaned you, but it also left a layer of salt that dried and made you scratch so badly you realized why most aboard didn't bother. Compounding all these problems was the sweltering heat below decks, especially when submerged, that pushed the thermometer well beyond its 120-degree limit. These hardships he bore, but nobody had warned him of the headache. It had to be referred to in the singular, since he had been afflicted with it from the moment he came aboard, and it had never left him. Initially triggered by the concentrated reek of diesel fuel, it had been maintained by the heat, the constant pressure changes at varying depths, and the lack of air quality that left your mouth tasting as though you were sucking a coin. Now, in a deep sleep, he began to vividly relive the pain and suffering he had endured and stirred fitfully in his chair. His head had tilted to constrict his windpipe, and a loud snore erupted from the base of his throat. Shocking him awake, he sprung forward in his chair and leapt up in alarm to come face to face with 2 waiting operatives. One of them only just managed to remove a smirk before Carl struck him hard across the face with the back of his hand. Something amusing you? Chapter 3 shifts focus from the key protagonist, James, and introduces a major political antagonist, Eric Banner, and his advisor, Carl List. Set at a secluded ranch, the chapter opens with a morning training session where Eric dominates this spirited horse, transitions into a tense midday scene with a nervous operative, and finally plunges into a vivid, disturbing flashback from Carl's past aboard a World War II era submarine. It ends with Carl violently snapping back into the present, reinforcing his volatility and emotional repression. Eric Banner is introduced through action that defines him, authoritative, cruel, and physically commanding. His philosophy, that control over the weaker animal, is essential. It signals a dangerous authoritarian worldview. Carl List, while at first the archetypal cold handler, is deepened through a detailed and unsettling flashback that humanizes him without making him sympathetic. We begin to understand the cost of the discipline he now enforces on others. A central theme, control through discipline and fear, runs through the entire chapter. From Eric dominating the horse, to Carl intimidating a young operative, to his memory of surviving in an oppressive submarine, the idea of submission as survival is reinforced in layered ways. The theme sets up a likely ideological contrast to the protagonist, James, in future chapters. The ranch is described with rich, evocative detail: honeysuckle on the banks, shimmering heat, the oppressive weight of the sun. These natural elements support the oppressive atmosphere. The submarine flashback is especially strong in terms of tactile and olfactory detail. The stench, the sweat, the coin taste in the mouth, all very immersive and visceral. The chapter begins with outward action and ends with inward, descending into Carl's psyche. This movement from exterior control to interior torment is sophisticated and does add depth. The ending, Carl waking up, embarrassed, enraged, lashing out, closes the chapter on a tense, abrupt note, leaving the reader unsettled. You are now working on chapter 3. Return to your outline for each subsequent chapter from this point on, and move on slow and steady. Thank you very much for watching again, and otherwise, bye for now.